There is an open secret at Ester Manor. No one can last a full week working for Duke Alistair. That's no exaggeration. It's truly impossible. The previous secretary lasted 5 days because he spilled coffee on the Duke's cufflinks. A pair of heirloom obsidian cufflinks, said to be war booty, seized by the first Duke of Alistair from a vampire prince. The Duke didn't say a word at the time. He merely glanced down at his sleeve, then looked up at the young man, who was on the verge of tears. The next day, the young man was transferred to the northern mines to do clerical work. The northern mines, minus 30 degrees, with the eternal night lasting 4 months, and the only living creatures within 100 miles being snow wolves. Everyone said it was no different from exile. The secretary before her fared even worse. She lasted only 3.5 days. The reason she had smiled, just a single smile, as the Duke was signing a land expropriation order, she stood beside him. For some reason, she found the atmosphere slightly comical, and the corners of her mouth twitched ever so slightly. The Duke's quill pen halted. He didn't even look at her. He merely addressed the captain of the guards standing outside the door. Take her to the finance office to settle her account, now. No one knows why the Duke is so sensitive to laughter, but from that day on, anyone who stepped into that office wore a face, as stiff as if they were attending a funeral. As for that unlucky soul who lasted a full 6 days, just 1 day short of breaking the record, he was the Empire's former administrator, a seasoned veteran as composed as a diplomat. Everyone thought he had finally found his footing, but on the 6th night, while organizing a border customs report, he mistakenly wrote the export tax rate in the 3rd column as 0.5%, just 0.5%, a mere fraction. After reviewing the report, the Duke set the parchment aside, his tone as matter, a fact as if discussing the day's weather. You may leave. Alistair has no use for someone who can't even get the numbers right. That night, the administrator's wife wept at home all night long. He had worked at the Duke's estate for 12 years, rising from a lowly clerk to his current position, only to have it all ruined because of 5,000s. Once the news spread, no one in the entire eastern part of the empire dared to apply for the position. The job posting hung on the town square bulletin board for 3 full weeks, weathered by wind and rain, until the parchment had yellowed and curled at the edges. Yet not a single person came forward. Old Winst, the Duke's butler, grew so anxious that his hair turned another shade of white. Every day he stood at the gate, gazing at the empty street and sighing. He even went so far as to suggest to the Duke, "My lord, perhaps we should relax the requirements. We don't need 5 years of administrative experience. How about 3, or even 1? What about a recent college graduate?" The Duke was reading a military report from the front lines at the time. Upon hearing this, he didn't even lift his eyes, uttering only 2 words, "Number." Old Winston dared not say another word. Having served at the Duke's estate for 30 years, he knew better than anyone else that his master's word was law. Duke Alistair, the de facto ruler of the 19 city-states in the Eastern Empire, commanded 30,000 elite cavalrymen. Even His Imperial Majesty had to smile before speaking when he met the Duke. His rules were absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. But just as everyone thought the position would remain vacant forever, on the early morning of the first day of the 4th week, someone claimed the post. Old Winstone was sipping his 3rd cup of black tea when the doorman relayed the news. The doorman's young assistant had run up, out of breath, saying a young lady had claimed the posting and was now standing at the gate. Demanding to see the butler, Old Winston nearly choked on his tea. He set down his cup and headed out, mulling it over in his mind as he walked. Which young lady was so reckless? Or was she from out of town, unaware of the Duke's reputation? He walked to the main gate and saw the young woman. She wore a long gray-blue wool dress, faded from repeated washing, with frayed cuffs. A sagging canvas bag hung from her shoulder, and her brown hair was casually tied back with an old ribbon. A few stray strands were blown against her cheeks by the morning breeze. Her features were delicate, but she was by no means a beauty one would remember at first glance. The most striking thing about her was probably her gaze. Those green eyes were unnaturally bright, as if they held a small flame within them, completely at odds with her shabby attire. In her right hand, she clutched the job posting she'd torn down. The parchment was crumpled and wrinkled, with a bit of mud on the edges, perhaps from a fall on the way here. Old Winstead eyed her up and down, his brow furrowed so deeply it could have crushed a fly. "Young lady," he said, trying to keep his tone from sounding too desperate, "do you know who this secretary position is for?" "Of course," she smiled, revealing a row of neat, white teeth. "It says so right there on the notice, His Grace, the Duke of Alistair." When she said, "His Grace Duke Alistair," her tone was as light as if she were mentioning the old man who sold bread next door, completely devoid of the awe and fear that Imperials typically felt when uttering that name. Old Winstead's right eyelid twitched. "Then do you know how many secretaries before you were fired, before even finishing a week on the job?" "I heard 7 or 8. Anyway, a lot." She folded the notice in half and stuffed it into her canvas bag, moving as casually as if she'd just bought a head of cabbage at the market. 11, Old Winstead corrected her. "Just this year 11. Last year there were 9. Going back further, I've lost count." He paused, lowering his voice as if afraid the stone gargoyle crouching on the steps might overhear. "Young lady, I'm not joking. Our master isn't easy to please. You don't look very old. Don't throw yourself into the fire. The Empire is vast. There are plenty of good jobs out there. Why don't you look elsewhere? I'll have the gatekeeper give you 2 silver coins for travel expenses. How about that?" The young woman tilted her head, her green eyes blinking, her smile deepening. "No way, housekeeper. I just want to work here." Old Winstead was at a loss for words. In his 52 years, he'd seen countless people come to the Duke's mansion seeking employment, some trembling with fear, some feigning composure, and some strutting in with letters of recommendation from nobles. But he'd never seen anyone like this, as if she weren't here to apply for the most demanding position in the entire empire, but rather to keep a long-awaited date. He took a deep breath and decided to try a different approach. "What is your name?" "Isa. And your surname?" "I don't have a surname," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm from an orphanage. No one gave me one." Old Winstone's heart sank. Not a noble, no connections, an orphan, and a young woman who looked all thumbs. This was practically throwing dynamite into the Duke's minefield. He could already picture her running out the door in tears 3 days from now. He could even imagine the Duke's icy expression. And that phrase he'd heard so often, his ears were calloused. Let her go. But he had no choice. Rules were rules. The notice had been posted, and she was already at the door. He had no authority to turn her away. Duke Alistair hated nothing more than his subordinates making decisions on his behalf, no matter how reasonable they might seem. "Come with me," Old Winstead sighed, turning to head inside. "His Grace is in his study right now. I'll take you in to see him. But I'm warning you, once you're inside, try not to make a sound, don't laugh, and don't touch anything. Answer only what he asks if he doesn't ask. Don't say a single word. Can you do that?" "I can do that." Isa followed behind him, her steps light and brisk, her canvas bag swinging back and forth on her shoulder. "And one more thing," Old Winstead glanced back at her, his gaze settling on her old leather shoes speckled with mud. "Be careful as you walk. Don't trip over the threshold. Don't knock anything over. Don't." Before he could finish, a dull thud came from behind him, followed by the girl's gasp. Old Winstead froze in his tracks, closed his eyes, and silently counted to 3 before turning around. Isa was clutching her forehead, hissing through clenched teeth. Before her stood a column she'd walked straight into. That column had stood there for at least 200 years, so thick that two people couldn't wrap their arms around it. Coated in dark gray stone paint, it was practically invisible in the morning light, but the fact that she'd managed to walk right into it left old Windstone at a loss for words. "Does it hurt?" He tried his best to keep his voice from sounding too alarmed. "I'm fine." Isa rubbed her forehead, which was already red, but she actually managed to smile. "I've hit things much harder than this before." Old Winstead opened his mouth, then decided to say nothing. He turned and continued walking, his pace at least twice as fast as before, eager only to get her to the study door and wrap up this doomed interview process. Passing through 3 arched gateways, skirting the fountain in the courtyard, and walking all the way to the end of the second-floor corridor in the west wing, the large ebony door came into view. The door panels were carved with the Alistair family crest, a raven with outstretched wings, its talons clenched around a broken longsword. The raven's eyes were inlaid with obsidian, and no matter the angle, they seemed to be staring at you coldly. Old Winstead stopped in front of the door, adjusted his bow tie, then turned to glance at Isa. Her forehead was still flushed, a few strands of hair had escaped from her headband, and the strap of her canvas bag was askew. She looked nothing like someone about to pay a visit to the most powerful man in the Empire. Rather, she resembled a stray cat that had just emerged from an alley after a fight. He reached out, intending to help her fix her hair, but withdrew his hand midway. Instead, he sighed and offered one final piece of advice in a low voice. "Once you're inside, remember, don't smile." Isa nodded at him, a glint flashing in her green eyes, then pushed open the heavy ebony door. The hinges groaned with a low, rumbling sound, like the sigh of some ancient creature. The light in the study was much dimmer than in the hallway. The heavy, dark red velvet curtains were only half drawn, and the morning sunlight was cut into a narrow strip, slanting across the dark wooden floor. The air was thick with the scent of old books, ink, and cold iron, along with a faint, almost imperceptible whiff of pine, the lingering scent of the embers in the fireplace. The room was quiet, so quiet that one could hear the snorting of horses as the cavalry changed guard on the distant parade ground outside the window. Directly opposite the door stood a massive black oak desk, its surface piled high with documents, ledgers, and unfolded battle maps. The edges of the parchment were held down by copper paperweights, and beside the inkwell sat a cup of long cold red tea. Seated behind the desk was a man, his head bowed as he wrote something. The sound of the quill gliding across the parchment was soft and rapid. Isa stood in the doorway, not moving forward. She watched the man, studying the fingers holding the pen, well-defined, slender, and strong. On his ring finger was a black iron signet ring. The raven crest on the ring's face glowed with a faint, cold light in the dim light. He wore a dark gray, high-collared robe, its neckline adorned with a silver brooch shaped like 2 cross-short swords, the insignia of the Eastern Cavalry commander. His hair was a very deep brown, almost black, neatly combed back to reveal a broad, stern forehead. His brow bones were high, his eyebrows sharp as if cut with a knife. His nose was straight, his lips thin and tightly pressed together. His entire profile seemed carved from marble, every line screaming, "Keep your distance." Duke Alistair didn't even look up. He merely turned a page in the document, his voice flat and devoid of any inflection. "Name." It wasn't a question. It was a cold, icy command, as if he were long accustomed to the world, turning at his own pace, where everyone and everything must unconditionally obey his every query. Isa stood in the doorway. The strap of her canvas bag had slipped slightly off her shoulder. She reached up to pull it back into place, then cleared her throat. The Duke's pen didn't pause. Last name, none. The pen tip paused. A very brief pause, so brief that only someone staring intently at him could have noticed it. Then he continued writing, as if that answer hadn't been worth a single second of his time. Experience. Isa thought for a moment, then answered honestly, none. This time, the pen stopped. Duke Alistair slowly looked up. His eyes were a very pale gray, so pale that in the dim light they were almost transparent, like a lake surface covered in a thin layer of winter ice. When those eyes looked at you, you felt as though every layer of your disguise was being peeled away, leaving you stark naked and exposed to the icy winds of the tundra. He wasn't scrutinizing you. Scrutiny at least implies some kind of interest. He was merely confirming one thing, whether you were worth his time. And the moment he looked up, the answer was already written in his eyes. No. He looked at Isa for less than 2 seconds, his gaze sweeping from her flushed forehead to her frayed cuffs, then to the canvas bag slung over her shoulder, which looked as flat as if it had been stepped on, before he withdrew his gaze and returned it to the documents. "You don't need to come in," he said, his tone as flat as when he'd asked her name moments ago, as if stating the most obvious of facts. "Just go straight to the finance office, collect 2 gold coins and leave." 2 gold coins. Old Winstone had only intended to give her 2 silver coins, but the Duke's word had multiplied that tenfold. In his eyes, it seemed fending her off with money was the greatest kindness he could offer. Old Winstone, standing in the doorway, sighed silently, and gave Isa a meaningful look, as if to say, "Girl, that's it. Take the money and leave. There's no shame in it." But Isa didn't look at him. She looked at Duke Alistair, at the man who had already lowered his head to continue writing, as if she had vanished from the face of the earth, and then did something that none of her predecessors had ever dared to do. She took 3 steps forward. Old Winstone sucked in a sharp breath. Her worn leather shoes clicked softly against the dark oak floor with every step, the sound as distinct in the silent study as someone beating a small drum. She walked all the way to the massive desk, standing right in the center of the patch of light where the sun fell on her faded gray, blue dress illuminating the fine stitches of the patches. The Duke looked up again. This time, his gaze had changed. It was neither anger nor surprise, but a bone-chilling scrutiny, as if he had finally encountered someone daring enough to break the rules, and he intended to see exactly what this person was relying on. His quill lay set aside, his slender fingers were interlaced on the desk, and the raven's wing on his ring glinted in the light. "Did you not hear me clearly?" His voice was soft as a blade gliding across silk. Isa stood before him, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might leap from her throat. Sweat had already soaked through the lining of her wool skirt, yet she clenched the straps of her canvas bag tightly, forcing herself not to look away. She looked into his pale gray eyes, took a deep breath, and spoke word for word, the words she'd been rehearsing all the way from the hallway. "Your Grace, you need a secretary who can stay for a full week, and I need a job that can support myself." She paused. "Which of us do you think will have a harder time finding a suitable match?" Old Winstone closed his eyes outside the door. In his mind, he had already written the girl's ending. By tonight, she would be the 12th person to be thrown out of the Duke's mansion. The study was silent for a full 3 seconds. Then, the Duke of Alistair spoke in a tone no one had anticipated. He did not fly into a rage, nor did he call for the guards. He simply picked up his quill again, dipped it in ink, and bowed his head to continue writing his documents, leaving behind only a brief remark, his voice carrying a faint, elusive quality, perhaps sarcasm, perhaps both. 8 o'clock tomorrow. Be a minute late, and you know the consequences. As it turned out, Isa nearly killed herself on her very first day. That's not a figure of speech. She really nearly did. It happened 47 minutes into her shift. She was walking down the hallway with a tray of coffee when the corner of the carpet, tucked up by some careless attendant, caught the tip of her shoe, sending her and the tray tumbling forward. The white porcelain coffee cup traced a beautiful arc through the air, and the dark brown liquid splashed out with exquisite grace, landing with such precision it seemed meticulously calculated, splashing directly onto the chest of a single person. The person looked down at the soaked front of their shirt, then slowly raised their head to light gray eyes. Isa lay on the floor, her knees stinging from the impact, her skirt splattered with a large coffee stain. But she had no time to tend to the pain or wipe it away, because the pair of leather shoes she was staring at were the very ones she'd seen in the study that morning. The owner of those shoes was now wearing a charcoal gray suit, the front of which had turned a deep brown, with liquid still dripping down. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She scrambled to her feet, reaching out to wipe it away, but midway through the motion, she realized that spot was simply not a place for a secretary to touch. So her hand froze mid-air like a puppet whose strings had snapped. Duke Alistair said nothing. He didn't even frown. He simply pulled the neatly folded white handkerchief from his breast pocket, leisurely wiped the few drops of coffee that had splashed onto his fingers, and then placed the handkerchief on the side table. "Come with me," he said, his tone as flat as it had been that morning. Isa's heart sank to her heels. It was over the 12th. She was the 12th, and she hadn't even lasted a single day, worse than the one who'd lasted only 3.5 days, setting a new record for the quickest dismissal in the history of the Duke's estate. She followed the Duke into his study with her head hanging low, already frantically calculating in her head how many copper coins she had left in her pocket, and whether she'd be able to find a cheap inn to stay at tonight. Old Winstead saw this scene from the end of the corridor, sighed silently, and turned to have the finance office prepare 2 gold coins. But what happened in the study was nothing like anyone had expected. The Duke walked to the desk, took off the jacket ruined by coffee, and casually draped it over the back of a chair. The white shirt underneath was also soaked in a patch, faintly revealing the solid muscle lines beneath, but he seemed not to care at all. He picked up a document from the desk and handed it to Isa. "This is the production report for the northern mines from last quarter," he said. "Reclassify it by mining district and calculate the per capita output efficiency for each one. Have it ready for me before lunch." Isa was taken aback. She looked at the document, then at the Duke, then back at the document, and blinked. "You aren't firing me?" The Duke had already sat down behind his desk and picked up his quill again. Upon hearing her words, he lifted his eyelids and glanced at her. The look in his eyes was so faint it was almost devoid of emotion, but his next words left Isa frozen in place. "If even a trifle like this can scare you off," he said, lowering his head to continue writing, "I would be quite disappointed." Isa clenched the documents in her hands, her fingernails digging into the edges of the parchment. She couldn't quite put her finger on what emotion welled up inside her at that moment. Whether it was the irritation of being underestimated or the surprise of being given a chance. Perhaps it was both, but she knew one thing, that remark from this man, cold as ice, had not been meant as sarcasm. It was something she hadn't anticipated. She took a deep breath, sat down at the small table in the corner with the thick stack of reports in her arms, and buried her head in the task of sorting and calculating. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the earlier tension, and her grip on the pen was shaky, but her gaze was intense. So intense that even old Winstead, who had pushed the door open to bring her tea, paused for a moment, standing in the doorway and watching her for several seconds before stepping back out. Isa spent the entire morning finishing the calculations, checking the reports 3 times to ensure there were no errors as significant as a 0.5% discrepancy, before carefully placing them on the Duke's desk. The Duke picked up the categorized report she had prepared, flipped through it from cover to cover, set it down expressionlessly, and spoke a single sentence. "You chose the classification criteria well." Just that one sentence. No praise, no affirmation, not even the slightest inflection in his tone, But Isa noticed that he hadn't said, "You may go." He had said, "The classification criteria are well chosen." As she turned to walk back, the corners of her mouth curled up involuntarily. It was a very slight curve, so subtle she didn't even notice it herself. But those pale gray eyes behind the desk caught that curve in the very last second, before she looked down. The Duke's pen paused for an instant, his brow furrowing slightly before he resumed his perpetually impassive expression. That night, Isa lay in the cramped attic room the Duke's mansion had assigned her. Her knees were still bruised and the skin on her palms was scraped raw. But as she stared at the wood grain on the ceiling, only one thought occupied her mind. One day. She had made it through one day. And the Duke, who said no more often than he drank water, had unprecedentedly said yes twice today. Once regarding her method of organizing reports, and once when she asked if she could move tomorrow morning's regular meeting from 7 o'clock to 7:30. Although the second time, he merely fell silent for 3 seconds before giving an extremely slight nod. So slight that Isa almost thought she'd imagined it, but it was a nod. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, closed her eyes, and the faint curve at the corner of her mouth finally turned into a full smile. Tomorrow was the second day. She only needed to hold on for 5 more days to break that damned curse. What she didn't know, however, was that the real test wouldn't truly begin until the second day. The carriage ride from the estate to the Imperial Capital would take a full 2 days. This was the first time in her life that Isa had ridden in a carriage. To be precise, it was her first time in a carriage of this caliber, with an ebony body, the Alistair family's raven crest painted on the doors, dark red velvet seats as soft as sitting on a cloud, and double-paned windows that completely blocked out the howling cold wind outside. A small stove was built into the corner of the carriage. Its copper walls were engraved with intricate patterns and gave off just the right amount of warmth. On the seat opposite her sat an elegant lunchbox containing cold roast beef, white bread, a small jar of honey, glazed figs, and a bottle of red wine sealed with a cork. She had never even seen such things before, let alone eaten them. The orphanage meals consisted of dark bread and thin porridge. On holidays, they might get an extra slice of smoked meat. After leaving the orphanage at 15, she had worked to support herself, and her most extravagant meal had been a skewer of roasted lamb she'd bought at the market last month, a meal she'd stretched out over 3 whole days before she could bring herself to finish it. Yet now, sitting in the most comfortable carriage in the world, she felt as though she were sitting on a bed of needles. The Duke sat across from her by the window, flipping through a leather-bound notebook so old its cover was frayed, without so much as a single glance in her direction. Today he wore an all-black formal travel suit, high-colored and fitted at the waist, with shoulder lines so sharp they looked as if cut with a knife, over which he draped a deep gray overcoat, its collar adorned with that silver brooch featuring crossed swords. The light streaming through the carriage window fell upon his profile, tracing a cold, hard line from his brow bone down his nose to his jawline. He resembled a meticulously polished black marble statue. The carriage was so quiet that all that could be heard was the clopping of hooves, the rumbling of wheels on the gravel road, and the faint rustle of paper as the Duke occasionally turned a page. Isa sat across from him, her hands demurely placed on her knees, her back held perfectly straight. She dared not lean back against the seat nor speak a word. She had been traveling with the Duke for 6 days and had come to understand his temperament. When he didn't speak, it was best to keep quiet. He disliked small talk, meaningless pleasantries, and especially being disturbed while he was thinking. But 2 whole days of silence was simply killing her. On the first day, she had managed to pass the time by counting the trees whizzing by outside the window. By the time she reached over 3,000, the trees began to thin out, and the scenery outside the window shifted from the broadleaf forests of the eastern plains to rolling hills. Vast grassy slopes glowed golden, brown in the autumn sunlight, and occasionally she could spot flocks of sheep in the distance. Like small clusters of white dots moving slowly, she started counting sheep again. But by the time she reached 200, her eyes began to burn. Her head drooped lower and lower, and finally she leaned against the side of the carriage and drifted off into a drowsy sleep. She was jolted awake by a sudden jolt. The carriage rolled over a stretch of gravel road, and the body of the vehicle jolted violently. Her head snapped away from the side of the carriage, and she lurched forward, her forehead nearly bumping into the Duke's knee across from her. She scrambled to brace herself against the seat and sit up straight. Her hairband had slipped askew, and a few strands of hair fell across her cheeks. Her first instinct was to look at the man across from her. The Duke's gaze finally lifted from the pages of his book. Those pale gray eyes casually swept over her sleep, flushed cheeks, her askew hairband, and the faint drool mark at the corner of her mouth. She drooled in her sleep, a fact she had never known, because no one had ever watched her while she slept before. Isa couldn't read any emotion in his gaze, but her face still flushed instantly, the color spreading from her neck all the way to the tips of her ears. She quickly raised her sleeve to wipe the corner of her mouth, adjusted her hairband, sat up straight again, cleared her throat, and pretended nothing had happened. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." The Duke had already looked away, turning a page, his tone as flat as if he were discussing the day's weather. "You don't snore in your sleep. At least you're better than the last one." Isa was stunned for a moment, unsure whether that counted as a compliment. She stared at the Duke's face for 3 seconds, searching for even the slightest hint of a mocking curve at the corners of his cold, hard lips, but found nothing. This only left her more confused. When this man said things like that, was he being serious, or was this simply his way of expressing concern through sarcasm? She didn't have time to ponder it further, because just then the carriage hit an especially deep pothole. The entire vehicle jolted violently, throwing her from her seat so that her head nearly struck the roof. Instinctively, she reached out to grab something to steady herself, and in her panic, she grabbed the arm the Duke had extended across from her. His palm steadied her elbow with just the right amount of pressure. Not too much, not too little, enough to help her settle back into her seat. Isa sat back down, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure if it was from the shock of nearly falling or the lingering sensation on her wrist. His hand had been steady and cool, and even through the fabric, she could feel that irresistible strength. She lowered her head to smooth her skirt, too afraid to look up at him, and missed the brief pause as the Duke withdrew his hand. He did not immediately pick up the book on his lap, but instead glanced down at the hand that had just supported her arm. His brow twitched slightly, then he resumed his impassive expression and turned the page of his notebook. "Thursday. Thank you." Isa's voice was so soft, it was barely audible. There was no reply. The sound of pages turning continued. The following evening, as the carriage began climbing the hill, Isa pressed her face against the window and finally caught sight of the Imperial Capital. She gasped, her whole body recoiling half an inch almost reflexively, her back slamming against the seat's backrest. The largest city she had ever seen in her life was Graven, the capital of the Eastern Territories. It had a castle, 3 cobblestone streets, and a central square with a fountain. In the summer, the area around the fountain would be filled with street vendors' stalls, and she had once spent an entire summer there selling woven bracelets. She had thought that was the most bustling place in the world, but the Imperial Capital was a completely different world. Looking down from the highway halfway up the mountain, the entire city spread out along the confluence of 3 rivers, like some kind of gigantic, shimmering living creature. The city walls rose dozens of meters high. The gray boulders glowed with a dusky golden sheen in the setting sun, and every few paces along the battlements stood a crimson and gold flag bearing the imperial double-headed eagle fluttering in the wind. Within the walls, countless spires, domes, and bell towers stretched out in layers into the distance. The tallest of them all was the main tower of the Imperial Palace, its summit gilded with gold leaf, burning in the sunset like a golden spear thrust into the city's heart. A thin veil of twilight shrouded the city, mingling with the smoke of cooking fires and the tolling of evening bells, like a kind of breath. The air was thick with a scent she couldn't quite place: toasted bread, spices, river water, horse manure, and something deeper that made her uneasy. She had thought this was merely a routine official visit, but looking at the colossal city before her, she suddenly felt a strong sense of unease. Invisible eyes lurked in every corner of this city, and those eyes were now all turning in unison toward the black carriage bearing the raven crest. Duke Alistair has arrived, and in the eyes of the people of the Imperial Capital, his arrival meant another spectacle was about to begin. As the carriage passed through the city gates, Isa noticed the guards' reactions. Upon seeing the raven crest on the carriage, the expressions of every gate guard in their gold and crimson uniforms changed. Some stood straighter, some instinctively took a half step back, and some exchanged a meaningful glance with a comrade. They didn't even ask for the carriage to stop for inspection. They simply waved it through, moving so quickly, it was as if they were sending away a plague god. Isa averted her gaze and stole a glance at the Duke. He still sat with his head bowed over his book, as if nothing outside the window had been worth his attention. But she noticed his page, turning had slowed. The knuckle of his right index finger was slightly bent, turning white, one of the few subtle signals she'd learned to recognize in him over the past week. He was suppressing some emotion, not nervousness, and certainly not fear, but something deeper and colder, like a hunter in the depths of a dense forest, who has caught the scent of a predator and silently tightens his grip on the trigger. The carriage continued along the capital's main thoroughfare, Imperial Avenue. The street was lined with densely packed shops and mansions. The gray stone townhouses stood in uniform rows, their lintels carved with family crests. Candlelight shone from every window, yet Isa could not shake the feeling that behind those flames lay unseen eyes, peering through the gaps in the curtains to scrutinize the black carriage. Pedestrians on the street hurried out of the way. Some recognized the raven crest on the carriage and began whispering to those around them. The voices were indistinct through the carriage window, but Isa could make out a few words from their lip movements. Duke of the East, he's here. It's him. And with each word spoken, the tension in the air thickened. Finally, the carriage came to a stop in front of a detached, gray stone mansion. The 4-story building was covered in old vines, and the wrought iron gate bore the same raven crest. 2 rows of servants stood at the entrance, led by a gray-haired butler in a crisp black uniform, a raven pinned to his lapel. As soon as he saw the carriage stop, he stepped forward to open the gate, his face bearing that dignified excitement unique to a long-serving servant. Once the carriage came to a complete stop and the door opened, the Duke put away his book, stood up, and stepped out of the carriage with a precision, as if he had rehearsed the ritual 1,000 times. Without looking back, he strode purposefully toward the mansion's entrance, tossing a single sentence over his shoulder to Isa, who was following behind him. "Pack your things tonight. You'll be coming with me to the palace first thing tomorrow morning." Isa hopped down from the carriage, clutching her canvas bag, nearly tripping over the threshold again. She steadied herself by grabbing the doorframe. She looked up at the Duke's back as he vanished into the shadows of the porch, and the vague unease in her heart finally crystallized into a concrete thought. Everyone in the Imperial Capital was watching him. And he was Duke Alistair, Lord of the East, commanding a mighty army, a man even the Emperor had to respect. Of course, he didn't care what others thought, but she was different. She was just a secretary, without even a surname, clumsy and awkward, capable of nothing but taking notes and organizing documents. The best dress she was wearing had been sewn by her own hand last week at the Graven Market using discounted fabric. Standing in the spacious entrance hall of the gray stone mansion, in the Imperial Capital. She looked up at the crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling and suddenly felt as insignificant as a grain of sand accidentally blown into the palace by the wind, ready at any moment to be gently brushed away by a hand and vanish into a crevice. Early the next morning, Isa woke up in a guest room at the Greystone Manor. She stared at the unfamiliar ceiling for a long moment before she remembered where she was. Mornings in the capital were much colder than in the Eastern Territories. The air carried a damp, stony scent, and the low toll of the church bells could be heard outside the window. 6 strikes. She quickly got out of bed, washed up, and put on the best dress she'd dug out from the bottom of her trunk the night before. A deep blue cotton gown with a small circle of white lace she'd sewn onto the neckline herself, though it was probably not even fit for a servant compared to what the noblewoman of the Imperial Capital wore. It was all she owned. She stood before the mirror and braided her hair into the simplest of plaits. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped out. Downstairs, the Duke was already standing in the center of the entrance hall. Today he wore a formal audience robe, a pure black, high-colored gown with subtle silver embroidery of raven motifs along the collar and cuffs. The epaulets bore the Alistair family silver sword crest, and a wide belt of matching silver and black wrapped around his waist. Standing there, he made the air around him seem to drop several degrees. He saw Isa coming down the stairs, his gaze lingering on her for a second before turning to the elderly butler behind him. "Find her a decent outfit," he said, his tone flat. "We have many people to see today." The old butler bowed and withdrew. Within 10 minutes he returned holding a neatly folded dress, a deep dark green fabric so soft and smooth it resembled flowing water. The neckline and cuffs were adorned with simple silver buttons, and the clean, elegant cut made it clear this was no ordinary fabric. Isa hurriedly waved her hands, saying it wasn't necessary. She'd be fine in what she was wearing. Without turning his head, the Duke cut her off with, "This isn't for you, it's for my reputation," effectively shutting down her protests. She changed into the dress and stood before the mirror, almost failing to recognize the person reflected back at her. The dark green made her skin look unexpectedly fair. The hem fell just above her ankles, so she wouldn't trip while walking. The old butler's eye for selecting clothes was frighteningly precise. She reached out to touch the silver button on the cuff. Her fingertips brushed against the cool, smooth metal surface, and a vague feeling welled up inside her. The new clothes made her look completely different, as if some sort of status had been bestowed upon her overnight. Yet she was more aware than ever that this was merely a facade. When the carriage stopped at the palace gates, Isa looked through the window at the magnificent archway at the base of the golden tower. The pounding of her heart drowned out the sound of the carriage wheels, grinding over the gravel. The door opened, and the Duke stepped out first. Isa followed behind him, struggling to keep her knees from trembling. She noticed that the moment the Duke stepped through the palace gates, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders pulled back slightly, his chin lifted an inch, and his stride became slower and steadier, each step as if he were treading on an invisible chessboard. Once inside the palace, her perception was completely transformed. The mirror, smooth mica dome, was 3 times larger than the small chapel at their orphanage. Its surface covered in mythological murals, a double-headed eagle tearing at a dragon's throat, its golden wings shimmering in the candlelight. It took them nearly 10 minutes to reach the audience chamber. Royal guards in golden armor stood on either side of the corridor. Each was more than a head taller than her, their eyes beneath the visors turning slowly with their steps. Isa stayed close behind the Duke, trying her best to make her footsteps look anything but like she was running away. The doors to the audience hall were 2 massive, gilded oak panels carved with the imperial double-headed eagle crest. The door handles were 2 splayed eagle talons, their sharp tips fitting perfectly into the bronze rings below. The chamberlain at the entrance announced loudly, "His Grace Duke Alistair has arrived." The voice echoed several times beneath the dome, like some kind of pronouncement. The door slid open slowly, revealing the full expanse of the audience hall to Isa. It was a hall so vast, it took her breath away. The floor was laid with giant checkerboard patterns of black and white mica stone, each square larger than the span of her outstretched arms. Deep red velvet tapestries hung from the walls, embroidered with scenes of the Empire's military triumphs throughout the ages. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the dome, its shimmering light reflected by the checkerboard floor beneath her feet into countless shards of light. Stepping upon it felt like walking across the Milky Way. Isa had to crane her neck almost to the breaking point to see the imperial dais high at the far end of the hall. 7 tiers of steps, a solid gold balustrade, and velvet drapes as crimson as blood. The imperial throne stood empty, exuding a deliberate air of disdain. Yet both sides of the hall were packed with people. The men wore robes embroidered with gold thread. The women were draped in silk and jewels. Every face was as exquisitely carved as a painting. Every gaze was as sharp as a knife's edge. Every whispered exchange carried the unique hypocrisy and menace of the court. The moment the Duke entered the hall, all conversation ceased and every gaze turned in the same direction. A strange silence hung in the air, not one of respect, but of wariness and assessment. Isa followed behind the Duke through the gaps in the crowd, clearly sensing the subtle shifts in those glances as they swept over her. Some frowned, some raised an eyebrow, and some used their fans to hide the cold smirks at the corners of their mouths. She looked down at her hand, sewn cloth shoes, and the dark green dress that was clearly borrowed, wishing she could shrink into a tiny speck. She was doing her utmost to stay calm. But in reality, she didn't dare breathe too loudly, and her palms were already drenched in sweat. Just then, a short, stout, middle-aged man pushed his way through the crowd. He wore an overly flashy gold, embroidered waistcoat, his chest studded with medals and trinkets, and his face plastered with an exaggeratedly bright smile. Though that smile was merely superficial beneath it, his small eyes glinted with a deeply unsettling intensity. "Alistair, my dear old friend." He threw his arms wide in greeting, his voice booming loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "You finally emerged from that backwater. I thought you were going to be stuck out there on that frozen wasteland in the east until the end of time." The Duke stopped in his tracks and tilted his head slightly to glance at the man. The look in his eyes was utterly detached, as if he were merely observing a rock in his path. "Marquis of Gloucester," he said, his tone devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "You are well informed." Gloucester's smile remained fixed, but his small eyes had already darted back and forth over Isa. That look made Isa feel thoroughly uneasy. It wasn't mere scrutiny, but something far more sinister, as if he were assessing the value of a commodity. "And this is—" Gloucester tilted his head, asking in a tone of curiosity that bordered on flippancy, "You're new?" "Attendant. I recall you never brought female companions when you visited the palace before." He drew out the word attendant slowly, the implication thick. Isa felt her face flush, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I am the Duke's secretary," she said. "My name is Isa." "Secretary." Gloucester let out a short laugh, a shrill, piercing sound like a mouse whose tail had been stepped on. "Do they have to recruit secretaries from the commoners in the East now? Or is it—" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, but making sure the people nearby could hear. "Does His Grace find commoner girls more manageable?" Some of the nobles around them covered their mouths and chuckled softly. The laughter was faint, but in the quiet hall, it pierced Isa's ears like needles. She opened her mouth to retort, but her throat felt as if stuffed with cotton. She knew all too well that in a place like this, her birth was an original sin. She wasn't even worthy of standing here, let alone opening her mouth to defend herself. Her fingernails dug into her palms, and she lowered her eyelashes, preparing to swallow her pride in silence, just as she had learned to do countless times in her life. But the Duke turned away before she could speak. "Gloucester," he said, his voice neither loud nor soft, yet clear enough to carry across half the audience chamber. The kickbacks you pocketed from last month's military procurement in the South would be enough to keep you mining in the northern mines for 20 years. Do you want me to read the audit report aloud in front of everyone? Gloucester's smile finally froze. The fat on his face twitched as he opened his mouth to say something, but the Duke had already turned back and continued walking, as if his remark had been nothing more than a casual flick of dust from his sleeve. Isa paused for a moment, then quickened her pace to catch up. She glanced back at Gloucester and saw that the short, stout Marquis was still standing in the same spot. His smile shattered into fragments of embarrassment. The nobles around him, who had been laughing just moments ago, had all dropped their expressions and were staring at the floor, afraid that the Duke's next barb might be aimed at them. She turned back, watching the Duke's broad, dark silhouette, a complex emotion she couldn't quite name churning within her. Was it gratitude or something deeper? She felt as though something inside her had been stirred. In this place where everyone was cold and hypocritical, the coldest man of all had become her only shield. Yet she was also acutely aware Gloucester would not let this rest. In this palace, anyone publicly humiliated would remember the debt. And she, the weakest link at the Duke's side, would sooner or later become the target of their revenge. From the very beginning, that royal banquet was shrouded in an air of unreality. The light from the crystal chandelier shattered into a million fragments, spilling across the gold-rimmed plates, while the long banquet table was laden with delicacies, whose names Isa could not recall. When the roasted peacock was served, its feathers were still intact, still embedded in the crisp, golden skin. The oysters in the silver platters lay on crushed ice like rows of pale, staring eyes, and the swirling red wine in the crystal glasses reminded her of the deep red velvet curtains in the Duke's study. Everyone was laughing, everyone was talking, and everyone's lips were smeared with grease and wine stains. But beneath that laughter lay hidden blades. Behind those pleasantries lay traps, and every clink of glasses seemed to seal some invisible deal. Isa sat at the far end of the long table, her fingers clenching the napkin on her lap, so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wore a dark green evening gown the old butler had scrounged up at the last minute. The neckline was lower than any garment she'd ever worn in her life, and the chill below her collarbone made her feel thoroughly uncomfortable. Her gaze never strayed from the figure in the black tuxedo seated in the middle of the table. The Duke sat surrounded by several high-ranking nobles, his demeanor composed as he held a wineglass in one hand, appearing as cold and aloof as ever. But Isa noticed he was drinking faster than usual tonight, and his right index finger kept tapping the table silently, a small tick that only appeared when he was anxious. The host of the banquet sat at the head of the long table. Crown Prince Audrich, a pale, gaunt young man with impeccably combed blonde hair. His features bore the distinctive refinement of the royal family, but those pale blue eyes always reminded Isa of the dead fish she'd seen in the orphanage kitchen as a child. His voice was soft and syrupy, the end of every sentence drawn out as if he were deliberately testing his listeners' patience. Every word he spoke tonight pointed in the same direction, the northern mine. First, he praised the sound governance of the Eastern Territories. Then he lamented the Empire's strained finances. Finally, shifting the subject, he asked the Duke in an almost innocent tone whether he would be willing to temporarily surrender 30% of the Vane's profits to the Imperial Treasury to alleviate the royal family's immediate financial crisis. 30%. Though Isa knew nothing of politics, she had helped the Duke organize the Eastern Territory's financial documents, and knew that the northern mines accounted for nearly 40% of the Eastern Territory's revenue. Handing over 30% of the profits was tantamount to cutting off one of the Duke's legs. The air in the entire banquet hall froze at that moment. All conversation ceased, all cutlery hung midair, and everyone's gaze turned to the Duke. The Crown Prince waited with a smile for an answer, while Crown Princess Victoria, seated beside him, leaned back in her chair with an almost languid air. Her fingers twirled a strand of golden hair that had fallen by her temple. A faint smile played at the corners of her mouth as her deep blue eyes fixed unblinkingly on the Duke. Isa watched the scene from afar, her heart pounding as if someone were pounding her chest with a fist. She saw the Duke set down his wine glass. His fingers tapped the tabletop one last time before coming to a halt, and then he rose slowly to his feet. Everyone's gaze followed his movements upward, like a troupe of puppets controlled by invisible strings. "Your Highness," the Duke's voice was neither high nor low, yet in this banquet hall so quiet one could hear the crackling of candle wicks. It rang out as clear as a knife striking a stone floor. "I'm afraid I cannot agree. The Northern Vanes belong to the Alistair family. The feudal charter signed in the late Emperor's own hand 300 years ago states this clearly. The royal house has no right to interfere with our jurisdiction over the resources of our lands." A deathly silence hung in the air for about 3 seconds. Then the Crown Prince smiled. That smile made Isa's stomach clench. It was not the awkward grimace of rejection, nor the cold sneer of anger, but a smile so composed it bordered on cruelty, as if he had been waiting for his prey to walk into the trap all along. "I knew you would say that," Audrich said, clapping his hands lightly. The doors to the banquet hall burst open, and 2 squadrons of royal guards in golden armor filed in, the clanging of metal armor filling the air. Their long spears glinted coldly in the candlelight, their tips all pointing in the same direction. At that very moment, the nobles seated on either side of the long table rose as one, as if rehearsed, pushing back their chairs. From their cuffs, the insides of their belts, and even the ladies' hair buns, they drew small crossbows and daggers they had concealed beforehand. Those who had been clinking glasses and toasting moments ago were now all fully armed enemies. The Marquis of Gloucester leaned halfway out of the crowd, a smug grin plastered across his face, a jewel-encrusted dagger in his hand, its tip aimed directly at the Duke's chest. "Alistair," he said, his voice tinged with the relish of revenge, "did you really think this Imperial Capital was still the place where you used to rule with an iron fist? I've long wanted to see you on your knees, and tonight my wish is finally granted." In her state of utter shock, Isa barely noticed that someone had approached her from behind. A rough, large hand clamped over her mouth, while another arm wrapped around her waist, like an iron band, lifting her from her seat. A breath mingled with the scent of smoke and leather hit the back of her neck, making her feel sick to her stomach. The tip of the dagger pressed against the artery on the side of her throat, a chill spreading from her collarbone straight down her spine. "Don't move," the guard holding her hostage whispered, his voice as rough as sandpaper. All of this happened in less than 5 seconds. The Duke turned with a slowness bordering on elegance. His gaze swept over the guards surrounding him, over the nobles holding their crossbows, and finally settled on the captive Isa. In those pale gray eyes, Isa saw something she had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, but a more primal, desperate resolve, like a cornered beast finding an escape. That look made her heart skip a beat, not out of fear, but because she read a single truth in those eyes. He had anticipated this outcome. He had known from the very beginning that tonight was a trap, yet he had come anyway. "Why, Alistair?" Crown Princess Victoria's voice came from the head of the long table, as smooth as silk wrapped around a blade. She rose slowly, one hand resting on the table, the other lifting the crystal goblet before her, her posture as elegant as a painting. Her gaze swept past the rim of the glass to rest on the Duke, and her smile deepened slightly, though her deep blue eyes churned with an almost sickening fervor. "Kneel," she said, "and hand over the seal of the North. I can let you leave alive." The Duke did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Isa, or more precisely, on the dagger pressed against her throat. Isa could sense his breathing change, though they were separated by the entire length of the ballroom. She just knew. For at that moment, The fingers of his hand at his side had clenched into a fist, his knuckles turning white, the exact same shade of white as when he'd been flipping through the book in the carriage that day. "Is that your condition?" The Duke finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "It is my mercy," Victoria said, a smile finally cracking at the corners of her mouth, revealing the raw hatred beneath. "When you rejected me all those years ago, you didn't offer me any conditions. Back then." Rejection. Those two words were like keys, simultaneously unlocking a door in Isa's mind that had long remained hidden. It turned out that what Victoria had ever wanted was never the Queen's crown, but rather the older grey stone chair of the Duchess of Alistair engraved with the raven crest. She couldn't have it, so she chose the highest position in the Empire as her revenge. Yet even from that vantage point, she discovered, she still couldn't have it. A woman tormented by hatred and rejection for 3 years. When she finally got her chance for revenge, her cruelty knew no bounds. "I remember it clearly." Victoria's voice grew sharp, the veneer of elegance peeling away layer by layer. "You said the bloodline of the Alistair family could not intermarry with outsiders. You said it was a curse, a fate. I believed you then. I truly did. Only later did I realize there was no such thing as a bloodline curse. It was merely an excuse for you to reject me." Her hand holding the wine glass trembled slightly, the red wine leaving dark streaks on the glass. The smile at the corner of her mouth collapsed in an instant into a nearly ferocious grimace. "So I swore that sooner or later I would make you kneel before me and admit with your own mouth that you made the wrong choice back then." The Duke remained silent for a long time. So long that the candles in the banquet hall had burned down a good bit. So long that Isa's knees had begun to tremble, and the tip of the knife had pressed a faint red mark into her neck. Finally he spoke, his voice so low it seemed to be squeezed from the very depths of his chest. "You're right. There is no blood curse, only a familial affliction, a hereditary blood disease passed down through the generations. It manifests earlier in my generation, which is why I dared not drag you into this." Victoria's smile froze. "Let her go," the Duke said, his knees beginning to buckle. "I'll kneel." Isa watched his knees sink inch by inch, those eyes the proudest, most arrogant she had ever seen, drawing closer to the ground. She heard a sharp snort from the guard holding her captive, like a loud slap. She could feel that this man would rather endure humiliation himself to ensure her safety, because he knew the cost of losing her was more than he could bear. "He loves me." The realization struck Isa like a bolt of lightning, reducing all her fear, self-doubt, and uncertainty to ashes. This man who had spoken to her coldly from the very first day they met, this man who had reached out to steady her when she nearly fell, this man who had stood in front of her when Gloucester humiliated her, this man was about to kneel for her. And she wasn't worthy. She was just a lowly commoner secretary who knew nothing beyond keeping records. She didn't care about that. What she did care about was something else. She would never allow herself to become a bargaining chip for anyone to threaten him. Just as the Duke's knees were about to touch the ground, Isa made a move she hadn't even anticipated herself. She jerked her head back violently, slamming the top of her head into the chin of the guard behind her. The dull crack of a shattered nose reached her ears, and excruciating pain exploded at the back of her head. But the arms that had clamped around her waist like iron pincers loosened their grip. A dagger sliced a gash into the side of her neck. Scalding blood trickled down her collarbone. Ignoring the pain, she stumbled forward, threw herself to the ground, and rolled away from the guard, who was clutching his face and screaming in agony. At the same moment, the Duke's body snapped straight like a spring compressed to its limit. The moment his knees left the ground, his right hand drew a silver dagger, no larger than the palm of his hand, from the inner side of his long boot. He charged toward where Isa lay like an arrow leaving the bow, grabbing her arm with his left hand and pulling her behind him. while the dagger in his right hand traced a silver arc, cleanly piercing the wrist of the guard, who was just about to crawl up from the ground and lunge at her. The sound of the blade sinking into flesh was dull yet decisive. The guard let out a second scream, louder and more heart-wrenching than the first, and knelt on the ground, clutching his wrist as blood gushed through his fingers. The banquet hall instantly descended into even greater chaos. Some screamed, some retreated, and some raised their crossbows but dared not fire. It was too close. The Duke, Isa, the Crown Princess, and several high-ranking nobles were all crowded together in the same area. Any single crossbow bolt could accidentally strike someone it shouldn't. Amid the chaos, Isa was shielded tightly behind the Duke. She could smell the crisp scent of cedar on his clothes and feel the rapid, hot breath escaping from his heaving chest. His hand gripped her wrist so tightly her bones ached. Yet that pain made her feel safer than she had ever been. At that moment, all traces of elegance vanished from Victoria's face. She slammed the crystal goblet in her hand onto the floor and issued a command that bordered on a scream. "Do it. What are you waiting for? Kill them." No one moved, because an arrowhead was pressed against Victoria's pale throat. The person holding the arrow was the Marchioness of Gloucester, a middle-aged woman who had sat quietly in a corner all evening, ignored by everyone. She wore an unremarkable gray gown, her hair pulled back into the simplest of buns, her face devoid of makeup, silent as a backdrop. Yet her hand gripping the crossbow was uncannily steady, her gaze cold and focused, utterly unlike that of a pampered marchioness. True hunters always remain silent in the shadows. At that moment, the entire banquet hall seemed to be paused. Everyone, nobles, guards, attendants, even Crown Prince Audrich, froze in place, staring wide-eyed at this unexpected turn of events. Well done. It must have been exhausting scheming your way into becoming the Duke's informant. For the first time, a hint of laughter crept into the Duke's voice. It took the Marquis of Gloucester less than half a second to turn from smug to deathly pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a short, almost choking gasp escaped his throat. He looked at his wife as if she were a stranger, a ghost. This woman had been by his side every day, yet she had consistently clouded his vision with pretense and silence, and he had been foolish enough to be deceived by her for 3 years. You're one of his people." Gloucester's voice was so shrill it cracked. The Marchioness of Gloucester did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Victoria, her thumb firmly on the trigger. The Duke straightened his posture, wiped the bloody dagger on his cuff, sheathed it back into his boot, and leisurely adjusted his askew collar. His gaze swept across the faces of everyone present. The nobles who had just moments ago been pointing their weapons at him were now retreating, their crossbows trembling, their daggers slumping to the outside of their thighs. Not a single one dared to meet his gaze. "Your Highness," he turned to Audrich, who sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen, his tone as flat as if discussing the weather. "Tonight's events will be submitted to the Imperial Council tomorrow in the form of an official document. The jurisdiction over the northern mine, the royal family's abuse of power," and he paused, his gaze slowly shifting toward Victoria. "This farce of attempted treason orchestrated by Her Highness, the Crown Princess. Every single detail will be meticulously documented." Victoria's face was as white as a sheet. "You won't walk out of here alive." She ground the words out through clenched teeth, her voice trembling with rage and fear. "Then, you're welcome to try," the Duke said, already having wrapped his arm around Isa's shoulder as he turned toward the banquet hall's entrance. Without looking back, he added, "Tonight, my men have surrounded the garrison outposts at the capital's 4 city gates and taken control of the cathedral's bell tower and armory. Make a single move, and by tomorrow the capital will be a ghost town." The door closed slowly behind him, sealing the screams, curses, and wails from the ballroom away in another world. In the study of the mansion, The only sound was the crackling of wood burning in the fireplace. Isa sat on the sofa. The wound on her neck had already been treated by the royal physician. It was a superficial cut about 3 to 5 centimeters long. The antiseptic stung so badly she winced, but the physician assured her it wouldn't leave a scar. Wrapped in a woolen blanket and curled up in the corner of the sofa, she held a cup of hot cocoa in her hands, yet still felt a chill run through her body. It wasn't her body that was cold, but her mind, which kept replaying the scenes from the banquet, like a damaged film reel stuck on a single frame, looping endlessly. The Duke stood by the window, his back to her. He had already taken off his blood-stained coat underneath. He wore a white linen shirt with the cuffs rolled up well past his elbows. The dark red spot on his forearm, blood spattered there when the dagger pierced the guard's wrist, was still clearly visible. He didn't speak, nor did he turn around. He simply stood there in silence, gazing out at the night view of the Imperial Capital for nearly 10 minutes. Isa finally couldn't hold back any longer. What you just said, her voice still trembled slightly, about surrounding the city gates, taking control of the bell tower and the cathedral. Is that true, or were you just bluffing? The Duke turned around. His face had returned to its usual impassive expression, but a certain emotion that hadn't fully faded lingered in his pale gray eyes. Isa looked into his eyes and suddenly realized what it was. It was the aftershock of fear. This man was afraid of everything that had happened at the dinner party. Afraid of the knife pressed against her neck. Half and half, he said. There are indeed my men at the garrison outposts, but not nearly that many. The bell tower and the armory were improvised on the spot. The cocoa cup in Isa's hand nearly slipped from her grasp. You could improvise like that under these circumstances. Negotiation tactics. The Duke walked back to the table and sat down on the armchair opposite her, his movements several beats slower than usual. His shoulders slumped, sinking into the leather cushions. It was the first time Isa had ever seen him look so weary. It wasn't physical exhaustion, but the kind of weariness that seeps from the very marrow of one's bones after being held in tension for far too long. Another silence fell. The flames in the fireplace licked at a freshly added log, emitting a faint hiss. Is what she said true? Isa asked softly. Did you reject her back then because of that illness? The Duke's fingers curled slightly on his knee. It was a long time before he spoke. Victoria's father was a key figure in the old nobility alliance. She was raised from childhood to be a pawn in a political marriage. When she approached me, I was indeed wavering. His voice was low and steady, as if he were turning the pages of a long-sealed ledger. But before he died, my father told me that the Alistair family carries a rare genetic disease in our blood, one that begins to manifest at the age of 30. My father died at 40, my grandfather at 39, and my great-grandfather at 38. There are no exceptions, so I spread the story of a blood curse, partly to prevent anyone from exploiting our family's medical history, and partly because I didn't want any woman to marry into the family, only to become a widow. Isa was stunned. I didn't tell her the truth when I rejected her because I knew she'd say she didn't care, that she'd be willing to stay with me until the end. But what would happen after she said that? She'd regret it. She'd hate me. She'd look at me with that pitying gaze when my condition flared up, and I can't stand that. He paused, then lifted his head to look straight into Isa's eyes. I'd rather she hate me for the rest of her life than pity me for the rest of hers. Isa stood with her mouth agape, unable to utter a single word. She suddenly understood why this man had always coldly rejected anyone's attempts to get close to him. Rejecting warmth, rejecting tenderness, rejecting any emotion that might make him appear vulnerable. The reason he was indifferent to everyone wasn't because he lacked feelings, but because he didn't want to drag anyone into this cycle of certain death. He had turned himself into an iceberg, not out of heartlessness, but because he dared not allow himself to feel. But that didn't explain what had happened tonight. She set down her cocoa cup, pulled the blanket off her shoulders and tossed it aside, then stood up and walked over to the Duke. The candlelight cast a resolute outline across her face, and a pure white corner of the bandage on her neck peeked out above her collar. "Then why did you save me tonight?" she asked. "If I had died, no one would have blamed you. You were already surrounded and struggling to survive. Everyone would have thought it perfectly normal. Why did you kneel for me?" The Duke looked up at her. Something he could no longer suppress churned in his pale gray eyes. "Because I've discovered," he said, his voice so hoarse it seemed to be ground out from the depths of his throat, "that the fear of losing you has surpassed my fear of death." Isa stood where she was, staring at him without moving. The fire in the hearth danced behind her, casting a golden glow around her silhouette. She suddenly smiled, a smile that was both a laugh and a cry, utterly ugly yet so raw and unmasked. "Then listen," she said, her voice trembling, yet every word spoken with precision. "I don't care how many years you have left, whether it's a year, a decade, or a lifetime. I never plan to live long anyway. Living passionately is enough. So starting tonight, your life belongs to me. I won't let you have another episode. I won't let you die young, and I won't let anyone ever hold a knife to your throat again." She bent down, cupped his face in both hands, and pressed her forehead against his. Those pale gray eyes were mere inches away. She could see her own reflection in his pupils, hair disheveled, a bandage wrapped around her neck, eyes red as if she'd just been crying, yet smiling more beautifully than ever. "Because I love you," she said, enunciating each word clearly. "No matter who you are, no matter how long you live, I'm not leaving." The Duke's breathing went completely haywire. His Adam's apple bobbed once. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, all the coldness, restraint, and detachment in those eyes had shattered, shattering into a scorching, raw vulnerability that Isa had never seen before. He reached out, his fingers running through her hair, to cup the back of her head, pulling her into his embrace. Isa could feel his heartbeat, so fast it didn't seem like that of the ever-composed Duke, but rather that of an utterly exhausted traveler who had finally found a home. "You really are a foolish girl," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder, carrying a warmth, almost a tremor, she had never heard before. "Then you're a foolish Duke," she replied, burying her face in the crook of his neck and inhaling the scent of cedar, leather, and a faint hint of blood. They remained embraced like that, neither of them speaking again. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the dark red velvet curtains in the study were drawn tight, shutting out the conspiracy, ridden gloomy Imperial Capital as if it were another world. Outside the window, in the night sky, a shooting star streaked across the Capital, its tail trailing a slender silver, white line. It flickered briefly above the golden spire of the cathedral before vanishing into the boundless darkness. Isa did not see the star, but she knew she no longer needed to make a wish.